the most fundamental of questions for a journalist is whose story gets told and why. We ask that question every day when we make decisions about breaking news, and when we make decisions about headlines, and when we make decisions about who to interview and who not to interview, who to document and who not to document. An awful lot of what we do as journalists is oriented towards reporting on people with power, but there are also an awful lot of people on the other end of the power spectrum whose stories very often do not get told. Gaiutra Bahadur is someone I've known now for 20 years, scarily close to 20 years, and who, as long as I have known her, has always been concerned, profoundly and deeply, with this question of whose stories get told and why. She's asked those questions as a reporter in Austin and Philadelphia and Iraq. She has asked it covering immigrants and ethnicity. She's asked it covering war. She's asked it covering policy, and she's asked it as well in essays and reviews and a growing body of other kinds of literary work. What I wasn't prepared for, despite knowing all of that, is the extraordinarily rich and powerful story which she finally sat down to tell over the last few years in her book, Coolie Woman, The Odyssey of Indenture, a book that she'll talk about, but that is really, I think really three stories. It follows her great-grandmother and great-grandmothers and their generation of indentured servants, indentured laborers coming from India to Guyana. It's in part Gaiutra's own story of investigating and inquiring and putting together this forgotten history. And it's most of all the story of an invisible generation, several invisible generations of indentured workers, about whom no one ever asked until now whose stories get told and why. We were talking earlier, and Gaiutra described being at some book events in which people were there because this was their family story and no one had ever told it before, and that may be true for some here in this room tonight. To me, that is the definition of journalism at its highest purpose, to tell the stories of people who would otherwise be invisible. The way we're going to do this is that I think first I'm going to move here where I'm more comfortable and less pompous. Gaiutra will tell us a little bit about Coolie Woman and how she approached it and what she found along the way. Do a little bit of reading from it. She and I will have a conversation, and then we'll do a conversation with the room. And it will all be very informal. I should say that this is being videotaped. Will eventually be streamed on the Dart Center website, so when we do questions and answers, don't say anything that you wouldn't want your grandparents and grandchildren to hear, right? Also, I should say thank you to Alan Chin, who's taking photographs tonight, and if he sticks his camera in your face, be polite to him. I think I will just now, Gaiutra, turn it over to you to talk a little bit about this book, which was a long time in germination.
Yes. Thank you, Bruce, and thanks to all of you for coming. It's a real pleasure to be here. Bruce is a very dear mentor, actually, and is the person really responsible for my going into journalism and asking those questions about whose stories get told. So again, a real pleasure to be here talking with him today about this book. And thanks to the Dart Center, to Columbia, and the Center for International History for hosting this event as well.
And by the way, quick apology to me and to Manan Ahmad for not saying that. The Center for International History is responsible for getting many of you here tonight. So, yeah.
So it's a pleasure to be here tonight to present Coolie Woman, which is in many ways a cross-border book. It's both journalism and history. I'm going to read a bit from the book later, but first I want to talk a little bit about how the journalism allowed me to enter a history that is unknown and in many ways unknowable. Obviously, I use my reporting skills to mine material in the archives. This is what investigative reporters do. They work with documents. But above and beyond that, I had to rely on a reporting mode, really, to cope with the limits to material in the archives. There are many, many reasons for gaps in the historical record. Flooding or fires that destroy archives, the exposure of documents to light and oxygen. But then there are more subtle cataclysms, the structural kind, that keep documents from ever existing in the first place because of the way power held or withheld mutes certain people born into the wrong class, race, or gender. A historian in Trinidad talks about the need to free ourselves from the tyranny of the text in recovering subaltern histories. And he's right, the text is tyrannical. It was written by those in power who obviously had a vested interest in telling the story from their own perspectives. The perspectives of the indentured are mostly missing. Since they were not, for the most part, literate, they didn't leave behind letters or diaries or many other written traces of themselves. Only 2 indenture memoirs exist, and both, not surprisingly, were written by men. So the silence in the archives applies especially to women, a fact which made my particular undertaking especially challenging. My book traces the journey of my great-grandmother from Calcutta to the Caribbean in 1903. She went to British Guyana. It also seeks to tell the stories of the many other women like her, the 250,000 women who left India as indentured laborers or coolies. The traffic in coolies was a third the size of the British slave trade. And indenture involved a significant movement of people, yet it's not a well-known aftermath of the abolition of slavery. So my book has a high aim. It aims to recover what I think of as a lost history within a lost history, and that's the story of Indian women within the story of Indian indenture. Okay, so with that as my mission, the question that quickly arose was, how do I do that? How do I recover that history, and how do I narrate it when the presence of indentured women in the archives is really so ghostly? They didn't write down their stories in their own words. I could only read them indirectly through the eyes of government officials who occasionally took their testimonies. So I spent many, many hours analyzing ship reports about indenture voyages, transcripts of inquiries into plantation uprisings, newspaper accounts of intimate partner violence, and formerly confidential dossiers on overseers who slept with Indian women. However one-sided these sources were, they were incredibly valuable. I found the stories of particular women, stories of suffering, but also stories of daring, stories of victims, but also stories that showed women striving to be in charge of their own destinies. So there was a rich paper trail to work with, but however much it allowed me to reconstruct the texture of their lives, it was not a paper trail to the texture of their thoughts. How then could I possibly do justice to their journeys and their struggle to reinvent? I thought that a solution might be found, or at least an experiment tried, through the journalistic mode. And by that I mean a questioning approach. I recognize the tyranny of the records, but in the end I didn't oust them. I questioned them as aggressively as I could, as any conscientious reporter would. And then I supplemented them. I turned to photographs as a storytelling device. I wove oral and family histories, folk songs, the Hindu epic the Ramayana, and even body art into the narrative. Where written traces were lacking, I looked for visual traces and clues in the oral tradition. Where Indian women could not speak for themselves, I looked for alternate ways of recovering their commitments and experiences. And I wove myself into the story as their descendant. I wrote about my own travels to uncover my great-grandmother's backstory. She was 4 months pregnant and alone, apparently husbandless, when she left. To find out why she was alone and why she left, I went to her village in northeast India. I also went back to Guyana, where I was born, to explore how domestic violence against women there might be a legacy of indenture. I interviewed a woman who survived a cutlass or machete attack by her husband. I went to a rural jail to visit a man who was accused of stabbing his wife to death. I spoke with a mother who witnessed her daughter being dismembered by her husband. In going back to Guyana, I was both a journalist, objectively reporting a story, and a woman personally, subjectively involved in it. I'm the child of immigrants. I was 6 when my family came to America, and we moved from a village surrounded by sugarcane fields where we didn't have a phone or an indoor toilet, and electricity had just come to the village, to a small city on the outskirts of Manhattan. And this experience, this dislocation, gave me a way of seeing the world. It helped me imagine, at least to a certain extent, what it must have been like for my great-grandmother. In a way, the reporter's way of seeing the world has a lot in common with an immigrant child's way of seeing the world, because both ask questions. In the reporter's case, this is about skepticism. In the child immigrant's case, it's about identity. I think that many who immigrate as children are primed to ask not only who am I and where do I belong, but also who might I have been had my family never immigrated. We're perhaps conditioned to imagine multiple possible endings, to speculate about how things might have turned out differently if we had never left. So as both reporter and child immigrant, the speculative mode, the inquiring mode, seemed a natural one to adopt in telling this history. I was not going to overthrow the text, but interrogate it. And in fact, there are whole sections of the book composed just of questions. Questions that, in addition to being questions, paint landscapes, advance the plot, or convey a tone, an attitude. And what they convey is my own attitude to the official records, which couldn't possibly be neutral. I am, after all, a product of the history I've written about, and I can't help but have an attitude to the archives and to its blank or biased spots. So the historian Natalie Zeman Davis talks about how she tries to make silences in the archives work for her. I tried very hard to do this in Coolie Woman by making the elusiveness of Indian indentured women almost a subject in itself. The image of Indian women hiding and then revealing themselves recurs throughout the book. And I also ask what their silence in the sum total of history tells us. How should we interpret it? Is it purely a sign of their lack of power, or can their silence be seen as strategic, an attempt to keep secrets and to cope with trauma? So even when indentured women talked to their children and their grandchildren about leaving India, there were gaps and silences. There was a reluctance to share the full story of what had happened to them. I had to ask if it was at all possible that, as feminist poet Adrienne Rich has put it, silence can be a plan, rigorously executed, the blueprint of a life. Okay, so I'm going to just read a short passage from the book that speaks to this idea of gaps and glimpses and demonstrates some of the techniques for handling those gaps. It's from the chapter set on the seas called Her Middle Passage. Whenever a ship docked, the chief immigration agent at its destination had to report on its passage from India. Some of these dispatches, including the one detailing my great-grandmother's voyage, have been destroyed. But those that survive pull back the screen, if only for brief moments and partial views, on the lives of the women aboard. It is hard in these glimpses to escape the angle of sexual exploitation by figures of all ranks and races. In these archives of misconduct, the women appear resisting advances, or giving in to them, or, in the eyes of many ship officials, courting them. But the records also provide other views of the women: on deathbeds, giving birth, losing children, going mad, being driven to suicide, engaged in infanticide, rejecting or being rejected by shipboard husbands, demanding that husbands prove themselves, stowing away, crying, cursing, possibly in love and clearly in anguish. I cannot imagine that the journey was anything but a saga, even for immigrants whose lives aboard passed relatively without incident. Seasickness afflicted most. A majority fell ill with mumps, measles, dysentery, hookworm, or fever. The ache for home was so sharp that one ship surgeon declared, "I know that many die from nostalgia, pure and simple. The excitement of the newness of everything keeps them up for a time, but soon dies away and is followed by depression when they realize what they have done." The realization must have dawned slowly as the sea lengthened and the conditions aboard affected them one by one, as blankets rough as jute, sometimes rotten and foul-smelling, caused pus to form on children, as the fans for circulating air were shut down at night when most needed, as the condenser to make the water potable broke, which it routinely did, and as the floor beneath them sweated. All the while, surgeons prepared their balance sheets of births and deaths, recording Shiva's unending dance without realizing it. The Hindu god who destroys in order to create, who dances in a ring of flames to maintain the universe's ceaseless cycle of creation and destruction, did not forget the cargo hold. I'm referring to something far more metaphysical than birth or mortality rates. Here a woman born on a ship to the West Indies in 1888. On that mad ocean, when all was tossing, people's heads were spinning, and then labor pains started for Ma to have her child. On that mad ocean, I was born. On that mad ocean, I came to life. She was describing her own origins, but with her incantatory words, she could have been telling the creation story of our people, mine and hers. She could have continued in her voice of myth, "In our beginning there was a boat. On that mad ocean, we came to life. We passed the Red Sea to reach the Black. The water was blue before it was green, and then it was mud. We crossed 7 seas, 7 shades of water, shades of darkness and light. Light that died and darkness that was born. Darkness somehow extinguished and light rekindled. The captain's wheel became Shiva's fiery circle, turning and turning in its cosmic spiral. And in the gyrating of the gales and the churning of the waves, as one steered and the other danced, we became new. The moorings of caste had loosened, and people who had left behind uncles, sisters, husbands, and mothers substituted shipmates, their jahajis, for kin. Unraveled, they began, ever so slowly, to spin the threads of a novel identity. Indenture ships were not slave ships. But there can be no denying a few ties that should have bound the 3 million Africans trafficked by the British as slaves, and the million Indians transported as coolies. The people in the hold in both cases were cut from the same demographic, mainly young and overwhelmingly male. Women were in short supply and subject to sexual exploitation during both crossings. And both journeys were transformative, signaling a break with the past, making whatever came before it seem almost as unimaginable to later generations as time and space before the Big Bang. In the beginning, there was a boat. Having emerged from its belly as survivors, the indentured Indians could no longer be who they had been. Like the slaves before them, they were an entirely new people, forged by suffering, created through destruction. In this sense, above all else, theirs was a middle passage, marked by brutal reinvention. How do I even begin to situate my great-grandmother in this odyssey? If I draw an imaginary line from moment to moment on the ships, from glimpse to glimpse of women aboard. Will her shape emerge, constellation-like? Could the wrong shape emerge if I connect the wrong moments to each other? How do I know which are right? Will her constellation give off light? Thank you.
You know, as you were talking, you are reaching from your great-grandmother's arrival and journey as an indentured laborer, and you reach back to the history of slavery and the Middle Passage. I found my mind also going forward to the present day and recognizing that this is a story about human trafficking. We would frame it that way today, right?
Right.
How would you, both maybe historically, but also in human terms or political terms, compare the experience of indenture as you've come to understand it after your work with what we know of human trafficking today?
Well, the master narrative about indenture during the period by the British was that it was liberating. It was one of a set and series of laws that were passed in India that would liberate sort of the most oppressed, including women. But the story that emerges from the archives is a lot more complicated than that. It's not a story completely of victims, but it's not a story of liberation either. And in the details of recruitment, for example, there was a great deal of deception and incentives for recruiters to deceive because since women were in short supply and wanted on the plantations, recruiters were paid more for a female indentured servant than a male. So that led recruiters to spin all kinds of tales. And the stories that have come down to through the generations include stories of people thinking that they could go home for the weekend, that they were going to the lands of milk and honey, where they would be properly paid, et cetera. But in fact, the living conditions on the plantations were incredibly dismal.
So that element of deception, which is so central to a lot of what we hear about trafficking women in particular today, is consistent with the era you're looking at.
Right, and also, women who are trafficked for reasons of prostitution today could be and have convincingly been compared to the women who were taken to the plantations because there was a shortage of women. There were 40 women shipped for every 100 men. Many of them found that they had to serve multiple men, again, of all ranks and races, from overseers and managers on the plantation to other indentured servants who lived among them.
So, all right, let's now go back and talk a little bit about this sort of remarkable project, which is also a journey for you as a writer and journalist. You probably started out with a fairly simple question or idea. What was it? What started you on this?
Well, this began as a question really about identity. Who am I?
Yeah.
And it wasn't a book to begin with. It was just my own interest in and fascination with my connection to India and lack thereof. So when my family moved to the States, we moved to Jersey City, just across the river, in the late 80s when there was, an anti-Indian gang at work, the Dot Busters. We actually lived in the neighborhood that was the epicenter of that, and a man was killed, another was brutally beaten, and we had small-scale things happen to us. So we were being targeted as Indian while we were not actually. I'd never been to India, my parents had never been, my grandparents had never been. So I'd always sort of had this question about my relationship to India. That's where it began. But as I first heard about my great-grandmother and her remarkable story, and then started to investigate it, I was really much more intrigued by the stories of the women and their reinventions, so that it became less a story about identity for me, as a story about gender.
And what had you heard, what did you hear about your great-grandmother? And What were the first steps you took toward documenting that? What started you on this more ambitious road?
I didn't hear a whole lot about her growing up. The first time I heard about her, I was in my early 20s, and that's when my father told me what he knew about her, which is that she was pregnant, a pregnant woman traveling alone, which for the day in the Dateline is pretty remarkable.
Yeah.
The first thing I did was go to the archives in Guyana and try to find out as much about her as I could, and I was able to find her immigration pass. Which told me a lot about her, her age, that she was 27, that she was upper caste, that there was a burn mark on her left leg. She listed no husband.
And those documents then led you where?
And nowhere for a while, for years and years, actually. But ultimately to Northeast India, to Bihar, which is where she was from, where she said she was from. So I went to the village. I was in India for a friend's wedding, and on my way to that wedding, I stopped off and said, let me see what I can find, if this village still exists, who's there, who knows anything about her.
And as you began this work, what of your sort of newspaper reporter's skills transferred, and what did you have to reinvent?
Well, a lot of it transferred because I found myself in the archives looking at basically court documents, which is what you would do as a reporter anyway. I mean, the big shift was sort of in giving myself permission to ask questions that I couldn't, or probably knew that I couldn't answer in the end. My main question about her, for instance, why did she leave? What on earth happened to her? Who's the father of her child? And I never get the answers to those questions.
But to pursue them, you have to do something that even those of us who are reporters find very tough, which is to go into those zones of silence that sometimes are there because there's no record, but sometimes are there because there's stuff people don't want to talk about. When did that happen? How did that affect your process, that latter kind of silence?
You know, although no one really talked about my great-grandmother growing up, I did find that once I started asking questions of aunts and great-aunts, they knew quite a bit, and they wanted to tell the story. They were asked, so they wanted to talk about it. I mean, occasionally, you know, my aunt would say, this happened, but please don't put that in the book. Yeah.
And did you usually go along with that, or did you talk her out of it?
I talked her out of it. Yeah, there's really nothing to, I mean, it was about convincing her that there was nothing to be ashamed of in this history.
What were the, I mean, this is actually important because I think we don't always understand what are the points where people may worry about shame or worry about stigma. What were the kinds of issues that you found yourself touching?
I think this was probably more something I thought about in reporting the final chapter of the book, which is reported and is about domestic violence in Guyana. I should probably step back and say that as a result of the shortage of women on the plantations, they were sought after, so they were able to leave one partner for another. And when they did, there was this really horrible, violent backlash against them, and nearly 200 women were killed by their intimate partners during the period of indenture. And as I was reading the newspapers in Guyana, I was going back again for an archival trip, I noticed that some of the same crimes were still happening, the same method of attack, using a cutlass or machete, and some of the same reasons cited, jealousy or infidelity. So I spent a summer in Guyana talking to, as I said, a woman who had survived this attack, a mother who had witnessed it, and a man who was accused of committing a crime like this. And that's sort of when those issues came up, because you were dealing not with a document, but a human being who has encountered this. And I still, I struggle with this as a reporter. But in the end, you ask the question and let people answer it when and how they feel comfortable doing so.
And I mean, in that case, I mean, this case of intimate partner violence that persists and gets replicated over time, how did that change your view of this whole story, maybe of the community history? Tell me how looking at that issue, which usually isn't thought of as part of history is politics and movements of people and economies, then there's these social issues over here.
Mm-hmm. Right.
You're seeing these as somehow integral.
Yes, and controversially so. I gave a talk in Guyana in which I was held to task for this and told, intimate partner violence is an issue that all communities deal with, both blacks and Indians in Guyana deal with it. How can you say that it's linked to indenture? It really gave this book, which is missionary in lots of ways, even more of a mission, which is to sort of understand the roots of some of the challenges Indo-Caribbean communities are still dealing with, such as domestic violence and alcoholism. It gave an even greater purpose to the research and the writing of it.
And let's talk about the writing of it, because that's also a very big challenge. Okay, fine, you're a great investigative reporter. You go out into the archives wherever you are. You're in India, you go into Indian archives. You're in Scotland, you go into Scottish archives. You go into the British Library, and you find stuff. But then you find yourself writing a story that in some ways is beyond words, and certainly is beyond the usual structures of he said, she said tropes of journalism, right? Or of the kind of reporting that we do on deadline and in limited space. Where did you turn for models? How did you think about the writing of this as similar to but different from other kinds of work you've done? Because it's a different job, right?
Well, I talked about the use of questions, and that sort of, I used it as a device throughout the book. There are long sections of it that are just questions. And that actually came to me as I was listening to a New Yorker fiction podcast and heard the short story concerning The Bodyguard by Donald Bartholomew, which is written entirely as questions. There might be one or two statements in it, and I thought, well, I could give that a try. So that was one model. I mean, there's sort of an established tradition also of using photographs as a way to narrate a story. I mean, it goes back to the Greeks after all.
And we should say, and the book is for sale back there, and one of the great things about it are these fantastic plates. They gave you lots and lots of plates. Did you have to fight for that?
No, because the images were so great that they're part of the telling of the story, after all. But photographs, questions. The hardest chapter to write was the final chapter about violence against women, and I really didn't think that I could do it justice. So what I did in the end was incorporate my own discomfort into the writing in a way. I wanted to look away. I wanted to avert my eyes. And so I wrote that into the story, basically, acknowledging it.
And what was the point of acknowledging that to you? I mean, why do it? Why make this about yourself at all as a character?
Well, there's no way for it really not to be about me. There's no such, I mean, I could say that there's no such thing as objective reporting. I mean, we all come at things from a particular perspective. And in my own case, I was going back to Guyana after 30 years of being away, and there were many things that I didn't want to see, including, I mean, this level of violence against women. But, I mean, I think it's also representative of a larger instinct not to look at it.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, in the community, just, this is an issue that we don't want to deal with. It brings us shame. We should not talk about it openly, especially in the company of others who are not from this community.
Is this an issue in Guyana now in which there's a debate that is changing, or is it kind of frozen as a social issue?
I like to think that it's a debate that's changing. I mean, I met a lot of young women, some of whom had moved back to Guyana from the United States, who care very passionately about it and are trying to make changes. I mean, it's really very systemic. It has to do with gender inequality and women's access to education and work. So those are things that don't go away overnight, no matter how passionate the activist.
Yeah. So, and actually that idea of migrants moving back and forth and so on raises another interesting question. This book is, in a way, itself a migrant book because it's published simultaneously in 3 continents. How have people's perceptions or reception of the book differed from place to place? You've now done readings in Guyana, you've done readings in Britain, the book's been published in India. What are you seeing about the reception of the book and about people's perception of the story that you're telling?
Mm-hmm. I'm actually on my way to India tomorrow, so I'll know more about this later. But I think in India there's a great interest in the roots aspect of this. I mean, there is a healthy sort of roots tourism happening there where Indian Americans and Indo-Caribbeans go back and try to find the ancestral village. So there was an excerpt of the book that ran in an Indian newspaper, and that's what they were interested in, this story of return. Historically, indentured immigrants who had returned and met had a terrible reception, ended up in squatter settlements along the Hooghly River. In Guyana, amazingly, I think they were just really heartened to see this history being told. You would think that in Guyana, this is something they would learn in school, but that's not the case. A textbook about this does not exist.
Was there a point at which you realized, I've got a story no one else has got?
Well, I'm not the first person to write about these issues by any means. There are a lot of academics from the late 70s onwards who have been interested in gender and the shortage of women. And there are people who have tackled the question through fiction. But what there really wasn't was nonfiction in this mode, in the creative mode. Yeah. And so that's where I thought I could make a contribution, is because I think there is a great deal of power in telling a story or a set of stories that is true, that is factual. There is power in sort of rescuing those facts.
Yeah. And rescuing the particulars of your great-grandmother's story, too. How did you finally come to understand her?
I do have sort of a theory about what happened to her and who she was.
And is it too much of a spoiler to talk about that?
No, I can talk about that. Almost at the very end of my research, I had a conversation with one of my father's cousins, who is Sujarya, my great-grandmother's granddaughter. And she told me that she had overheard a conversation when she was a little girl, that Sujarya was sitting smoking a clay pipe and chatting to women who had been on the same ship as she was when she left India, and that she talked about being on a pilgrimage when white men in boats, that was the phrase that was used, came and promised to take her to the next stop on her holy tour. And she said yes, and ended up in the depot in Calcutta, headed for Guyana. So there was also this sort of like well-established pilgrim circuit for widows in northeast India that began in Bengal and went through places of pilgrimage like Ayodhya, which is where she was recruited, by the way. Yeah. And I think that she was probably a widow on a pilgrimage when she got caught up in this.
Right, and in fact, tripped up by deception on a pilgrimage, which is a remarkable thing.
It sounds like it, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, there are reasons to doubt the story. It was overheard by an 8-year-old. The story was told in the story was told in Hindi. The 8-year-old did not have such great Hindi, but I mean, this is the story that comes down to us.
And how did you come to think about her adulthood? I mean, her later life.
So the plot thickens, yeah? On this ship from India, she met a married couple and ended up on the same plantation as them, probably living in the same barrack room as them, and ended up having a child with the man, because apparently the woman was barren and couldn't have children. And then she had a second relationship in Guyana when she was moved to another plantation and remarried. So this is what my aunt was worried about my writing.
Yeah.
You know,
Well, and
how would she be seen? Would she be seen as a woman without morals because she had had multiple relationships?
And these are indeed the complexities of immigration stories, right? People don't always want to know about those complexities. I know in the case of my own family, my maternal grandfather was born out of wedlock, right, to a woman whose husband had died, fathered by someone who worked in the same factory as my great-grandmother. And this was a story that was just whispered about when I was a child and was kind of on the fringes of consciousness and was something that people didn't want to surface. I think this is the part of the immigration narrative that people don't want to know about, is how complex it sometimes was.
But to answer your question, I mean, I see her as a survivor doing what she had to do in order to recreate family, which is what she ultimately did do.
Yeah. When you came to the writing of this, what was your method for turning reporting into writing? I mean, you talk about the questions, and that's one thing. You just set down these questions, some of which you can answer, some of which hang there without answers, as they must. Mm-hmm. What else did you do to make a big narrative out of this dense fabric of history and document?
Well, I had a structure in mind to begin with, and thank goodness, because the amount of material I had, I was just like drowning under it. And it's a journey narrative, basically, on many levels. It's a journey in time, but it's also a journey across geographies. So I thought that's what I do. I would start off in the recruiting grounds, then I would move to the depot, then I would tell the story of what unfolded on the seas, then I would land her in British Guyana. And so it just, from that, once I had the structure, it all came together pretty neatly.
Cool. Let's go to the room now. Any of you have a question, or kind of line up at the mic, say who you are for the sake of history. Even if you haven't read the book, that's fine. Yeah, please.
Hi. I think so. I'm not sure.
Well, don't worry about it. Just speak your question, and I may repeat it for the sake of the video.
Hi, thank you for being here and reading out. It was a very moving part, the part that you read out.
Thank you.
I haven't read it yet, but I plan to. I wanted to ask, Bruce briefly touched upon this. How is it different to interview and report on your family? And how you said you convinced your aunts and some other relatives about parts that you wanted to include in the book, but how do you do that? Because it's difficult even if you don't know the people you're reporting on, but it's your family.
Yeah.
So how is it different to report on your family? Yeah.
It's almost, it is harder than reporting on people you don't know, because they will come back at you about it and tell you what they think. But yeah, I mean, I spent a long time with each of them. The interviews lasted for hours, and then when I had a sense of what I wanted to write, I went back to them and shared that with them so they would know the full import of what they were saying and what they had revealed, and that it would end up in a book and people would read this book.
But how did you convince them when they weren't very comfortable with some facts? What did you say?
Again, I mean, I had to share with them my own sense of what this story meant, and that it was a story of survival, so therefore something to be proud of, not ashamed of. So thankfully they bought it.
You gave them a mission. I mean, and this is something we do, right? That sometimes you do. One of the motivations that people will have for telling difficult stories to a reporter is their sense that it does some good in the world
Yes,
to do
thank
so.
you.
Yeah. Somebody else. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Kenrick.
Hi.
So I have two questions. The first one is, as you mentioned, coming from a Caribbean perspective, we're good at poetry, we're good at fiction, we write great novels, but we don't tell, I would say, popular nonfiction stories. We don't tell narratives of our history. And you touched upon that briefly, that, so I'm curious, why do you think that we all know these stories? If your Guyanese grandparent has told you, a foundational story, but we don't write them down and we don't publish them. So I'm curious, why do you think, as a culture, we have not done that as yet? Is it shame? Is it you believe it is not worthy of publication? And the second question is, in terms of looking at the Caribbean and how we understand how it was formed, we talk a lot about race, we talk a lot about class. We don't talk a lot about gender and sexuality. Do you think and then we use other paradigms from the West, from the United States or Europe to talk about how we were created as a people. Do you think we have to look specifically at Caribbean plantation culture and indenture culture to form a better understanding of race, class, and gender, to explain ourselves?
So again, a couple questions for the tape, a couple of questions about Caribbean culture. One about why some stories get told and others don't, or are told in oral form but not written down, and another about whether our whole notion of race and gender changes as you filter it through the experience of indenture and plantations.
Well, interestingly enough, the fiction, the art that comes out of the Caribbean experience, I think, is really obsessed with history and the forces of history. I think the reason why people don't consider the stories your grandmother tells you, don't think of writing them down and making them part of the historical record is perhaps they don't see them as being as legitimate, as what's received in a textbook. Derek Walcott said that history is a form of fiction subject to a fitful muse memory, and it all depends on whose perspective you're telling the story from, the victim, or whose memory you're relying on, the victim or the hero. So, I mean, part of the problem is, again, the limitations of the sources, material that just isn't there in the archives. And I was able to approach this because I didn't mind existing in that middle space that Derek Walcott talked about, seeing history as an imaginative project as well, a speculative project. So if more people were able to give themselves permission to do that, I think we would have more nonfiction narratives.
And what about this idea of, when you look through the experience of indenture and the experience of plantations, does it change your thinking about race? Does it change your thinking about gender?
Yeah, I mean, it's not the Anglo-American experience or model. It's not the Anglo-American, sort of black-white dichotomy at all. So there was really no choice but to look at things through that angle if you're coming from the Caribbean and a plantation society. And as you know, I mean, race there is incredibly fraught. And I think a lot of the explanations and a lot of the healing can happen through looking at our history in a more critical way and looking at how plantations work and worked in a more critical way. Does that answer your question? Yeah.
Other thoughts? Yeah, just one of you, come on.
I'm not going to speak in the dead mic.
Yeah. But stand up so the room can hear you. Yeah.
So, thank you for this presentation. I can't wait to read the book. But I guess what I was curious about was, and I don't know if your research will allow you to speak to this, to what extent do you feel like the story that you uncovered and told is specific to Guyana and the Caribbean? And to what extent do you think it's common to other experiences of indenture in the Indian Ocean, for instance?
Yeah. So again, for the tape, to what extent is this a uniquely Caribbean experience, and to what extent is it in common with the Indian Ocean and other indenture zones?
Yeah. I think there are many commonalities because of structural reasons. Again, like policies that were made about the number of women shipped, for instance, applied to all of these colonies. Those are policies made in Calcutta governing the outward movement of people. Once they enter their destinations, those destination societies, of course, it becomes a little more complicated because policies are set at that level too. For instance, in Trinidad and Guyana, there was ultimately a movement to get the indentured to stay, to give them incentives to stay by offering land or money. Whereas in South Africa, there was deep and active racism and an attempt to get them to return. And once their labor had been used to get them to return to India. So I was very careful of that, of not drawing conclusions that were only relevant to Guyana. And for instance, another good example is that Mauritius imported women as wives, not as workers. So the story there is a bit different. The women there they weren't guaranteed labor, and in a way that made them even more vulnerable. They had no regular source of income, however, piddling that income was.
Yeah.
So, my name is Anna Coates. So I'm curious, in the book you write about how you found a family in India that claimed you're probably their descendant, but I got the impression in the book that you were a little incredulous. So I was just wondering, do you think that's really your relatives?
Yeah.
And I get the mic will probably pick it up. I'll stop wasting everybody's time by repeating questions. Go.
Yeah. I went twice to the village. The first time I went, I had some botany students along who did the interpreting for me, and based on that conversation, I did have some doubts about whether they were the right family, because they thought her name was not Shiojaro but Ramjaro, and that she had a brother rather than a sister, so details were off. However, when I returned a couple of years later with someone who sort of made a business out of taking Indo-Caribbeans back to their villages, he calls himself Rootsman. We went to the land office.
There's some knowing laughter in the room, I think.
We went to the land office and looked at census records, and the details there sort of match the genealogy that the patriarch of this family had given me. And there was only one Muklal. My great-grandmother's father's name was Muklal. There was only one Muklal in the village around 1900.
Yes. So just stand up so the room can hear you.
I was just wondering, as a reporter and as a historian who's writing a non-fiction, and you talked about how you were trying to talk about something which is silenced. So were you worried about going wrong somewhere? And did you like exclude something out of the book because you thought it was not reliable? I'm just like.
Well, again, I acknowledge the limitations. If I didn't know something, I just simply wrote that into the story. I can't think of a particular case where, I didn't do something, I didn't use material because I didn't know enough about it. I left many things out, but not for those reasons.
Yeah? Yes?
So,
Just stand up so we can all hear.
so thank you so much for writing. Sort of almost identical, except that my great-grandfather was a Scottish overseer.
Right.
So there's that mix thrown in. But I wanted to know if you could maybe speak a little.
And that's in the book.
Yeah. I haven't read it, but I just I got it today. I just wondered whether you could maybe speak a little bit about the ways in which you talked about how these women weren't just victims, right? But they were active agents as well in resisting and reshaping and reframing their own history and identity. And I wondered if maybe you could speak a little bit to some of the ways in which that one played out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can share a particular woman's story. I think this is the best way of doing it. She was in a relationship with an overseer, a Scottish overseer, and as a result of that relationship was able to leave the plantation and the environment of the plantation barracks. He built a house for her off the plantation, but he'd never put it in her name. So at one point he gotten a promotion. He was about to be made manager and was going to take a trip home. And she knew that this could only mean one thing. He was much more marriageable now that he was a manager, and she suspected that he'd probably be returning with a British wife. So she kind of set down some terms, and she said, before you leave, this is what I want, or else I will complain to the immigration department and let them know what's been happening between us. I want $70. I want this house put in my name. I want cattle. I want donkeys. I want a donkey cart. So she could sort of set up in business for herself after it was over between them. So, here's an instance of just incredible savvy, right? And there were numerous instances like that in the archives.
Do you want to give us another brief excerpt while we have a few minutes? Pull one other thing out.
Sure. Okay, so this is a section set in the recruiting grounds in the 1880s. The very summer my great-grandmother crossed the Atlantic, a debate was raging over a law intended to keep married women from deserting their homes for the colonies. No woman could immigrate without her husband's permission. If she claimed to be single and officials thought she was lying, she could be detained as constables checked her story. This extra scrutiny of women resulted from the travels of two English civil servants in the remoter parts of northern India in the early 1880s. They were sent to investigate claims of all kinds of ill-doings in the recruitment of coolies for the West Indies, Fiji, and Mauritius. The reports they filed and the diaries they kept provide fleeting glimpses of the women targeted as potential emigrants. At times, it almost feels like these elusive figures are peeking through the pages, from behind a curtain separating the women's quarters from the rest of the house of official history. That's exactly the way Major D.G. Pitcher encountered a handful of women at a depot for recruits. It was just someone's house, a hive of tiny, dirty rooms that competing recruiters had denounced as, quote, a disgrace to emigration. Allegedly, there was no licensed recruiter in sight, and women were falsely kept there under promise of marriage. Pitcher, who was a minor judge in Lucknow, had been assigned to scrutinize the recruitment in the northwestern provinces. When he visited the discredited depot, he found several rakish-looking men loafing around, but only 3 recruits, 2 men and a woman. As soon as Pitcher left, recruiters from other depots pounced on him, claiming that the house was actually bursting with women who had been concealed from him. He returned immediately to check it out. I took the people by surprise, he wrote, and found about half a dozen more women who rushed into an inner room and were said to be purda. Of course, I could not on this insist on their coming out. Confronted with a tradition that had kept women from the prying eyes of outsiders for centuries, Pitcher had no choice. He had to interview them from outside a closed door. The women told him, through an interpreter, that they were not coolies bound for the sugar colonies. They were concubines, they said, in relationships with various men living in the house. Had the women disappeared behind closed doors because the specter of a white man with authority terrified them? Were they really in purda? Or did they have something to hide? They might have concealed their true identities using false names and invented pasts to sign up for indenture. Or they might have been recruiting for the colonies. Officially, women weren't allowed to recruit, but many of them did so regardless. Delegated by male recruiters, they convinced other women to board ships bound for British plantations abroad. Mainpuri, the district where Pitcher encountered the women hiding behind the door, had a reputation as a good place to find women for the colonies. The number of its recruits was so high that Pitcher wondered aloud in his diary if it had, quote, anything to do with the existence of canals and the as frequently asserted impotence of men in canal districts. Women seem to outnumber men drastically in the streets.
The very last chapter of the book, which you described earlier as being so difficult to write because you focus, among other things, on intimate partner violence and the violent piece of the gender history you're talking about in this excerpt, you call surviving history. And in some ways, maybe that's kind of a theme that persists through the book. What does that mean to you? How do you come to understand that idea, surviving history?
Yeah. Well, a lot of people have told me that they find the ending to be pessimistic. But I don't see it that way because, again, of the incredible instincts for survival of the women I talked to, and in particular the woman who had survived an attack by her husband.
And surviving, not just surviving violence, but surviving history.
That's right. I mean, surviving the legacies of indenture, which I talk about, gender inequality, violence, the violence of the plantation sort of internalized into homes and turned into violence against women.
One of the things I found most encouraging as I finally read this, and why I agree it's not pessimistic, is that this idea, the idea of survival is not just of biological survival, but of something else, of a kind of a soul survival. Is that what you...
Right, and I mean, the women were able to preserve their stories, preserve folk songs, preserve religion, I mean, which is an instrument of oppression in many ways in their lives, but recreate family, which was sort of in ruins during indenture. That entire institution was shattered. So the survival, you know, it comprises all of these things, all of these persistences, language, religion, and oral literature.
That, to me, is a remarkable place to end up after such a difficult journey. And I think we'll stop there. And thank Gaiutra for this great talk. We can continue it informally in the room. Now have more wine, have more food. Buy Gaiutra's book, which is back there, and she will sign it. Will you do